The following is an excerpt from the book Experiences of Thought by Anthony Kahn, available now on Amazon.com and Kindle. Loving logic in matters of mind, on the origin of lots of things. And naturalist Charles Darwin shook the world to its roots, or at least made the world reconsider them, when in 1859 he published his seminal work On the Origin of Species. Within several short decades, the acceptance of evolution had become mainstream among the scientifically minded, and the phrase survival of the fittest was coined as a kind of overarching summary of the processes involved. Yet to this day, it seems that the role of evolution is often either forgotten entirely on the one hand or misconstrued on the other. So what is evolution and what can we do with it? The concept of evolution is part and parcel with the name Charles Darwin, just as relativity is almost always only a few words away from the name Albert Einstein in a sentence. But as was the case with Einstein, Darwin's peers were already on the road to the great man's discoveries. Darwin, however, had gathered a great deal of observational evidence as well as unique insights from his 5-year-long world voyage aboard the Beagle, and began to come firmly to the conclusion that one species could actually evolve to become another through a process he called natural selection. Modern-day DNA studies make frequent use of the identification of genetic mutations in specific individuals to link them with particular groups. And it is these same mutations that over vast aeons of time can lead to very different species. These effectively random mutations that occur within our genome are regularly passed on to our offspring, and thus, the more specific mutations that you share with another individual, the greater the probability that you are closely related. But to understand natural selection and the emergence of whole new species, we have to consider the environments in which a given organism lives. In order to better illustrate this idea, let's consider a tale of two islands. Suppose that there are two islands that are well separated from each other by a body of water. On one of these islands, let's call it Island A, we have a species of some hypothetical, furry ape-like animal. Let's call it a mandicoot. The species has existed on this small, cold, isolated island for many years and has a warm, woolly coat to keep it warm. Competition for food is rife, however, and when a land bridge opens up during an ice age, connecting this island with another, Island B, located at more moderate latitudes, a great migration occurs, and the mandicoot species now becomes spread across both islands. After several millennia, however, climate conditions change and the land bridge is swallowed by the sea once more. Now we are left with the mandicoot species existing in isolation on both islands. So what happens next? Well, all the while, various mutations are occurring within the gene pool on both islands, and at some point in time, an animal is born on Island B with less fur. If you are a resident of Island B where it is warmer, being born with less fur is a great advantage, and whilst others of your species are dying prematurely in the heat, you are able to cope much better and are much more likely to survive long enough to have offspring, who in turn have a good chance of inheriting your fur-limiting gene. Over time, you will become the progenitor of a new variant of your species that is much better suited to the environment in which you find yourself. Your descendant mandicoot and womandicoots may even find themselves coming to be viewed as the most attractive breeding partners on the island. But be thankful you are living on Island B, for if your ancestors hadn't made the migration and you were stuck back on Island A, your particular mutation would have been far more of a hindrance than a help. You may not have been able to survive your first winter, let alone produce any offspring, and if you did manage to pass your mutant gene onto any offspring, alas, you saddle them with the same disadvantage. More millennia still come to pass, and on one momentous day, none other than Charles Darwin himself comes to survey your island as well as Island A and documents the existence of two separate species, the long-haired mandicoot of Island A and the short-haired mandicoot of Island B. With his inquiring mind, he is eventually able to establish the link between the two species and comes to document this tale of two islands. Now, the tale above is obviously contrived and also simplistic, but nevertheless, it illustrates the role of genetic mutations, isolated environments, and of course, natural selection in producing two separate species. Whilst some doubt that evolution can produce the diverse range of species that we see in our world, the reality is that the evidence is all around us. Look no further, for instance, than all the breeds of dog that have been selectively bred to exhibit desired traits, even within the span of recorded history. Here, of course, we are largely replacing natural selection with human intervention, but the principle is the same. Given enough time, even the most complex organisms can emerge as a product of gene mutations and environmental conditions. Perhaps a useful analogy to make sense of this can be arrived at by considering the mass of infrastructure in the world around us. As one individual, we are acutely aware that even small tasks can take us a very long time to complete. And yet we look at all that is man-made around us, and it can be hard to contemplate how mere humans like us can have built so much. But of course, billions of people over hundreds of years can produce the seemingly miraculous compared to what an individual can achieve with one tedious week of hard work. Ultimately, lots of diverse actions of simplicity eventually lead to complexity. There is, however, one important caveat we must always bear in mind when we speak of the role of natural selection. We must always remember that it is a blind process. Too often, one hears phrases of the kind, species X developed trait Y so that they could better achieve function Z. But such thinking can lead us to attribute too great a role to evolution. Evolution does not seek to achieve any purpose. It is merely a process that arises logically given the fact that gene mutations occur in varying environments. You can use evolution as your model to explain the origin of the diversity of life and the complexity which it entails. But you cannot use it to explain the existence of life itself, any more than you can say that physical processes in that complex organ, called the human brain, are the origin of conscious thought. When scientists begin to speak of evolution as though it is a sentient, creating force, it may be time to remind them of its limitations. Now, having summarized the basic ideas behind evolution in the Darwinian sense of the word, it may seem that we are ready to move on to new topics. But we have really just looked at one example of what is actually a ubiquitous, logical process. Let us now consider some other ways in which evolution is at work in our world. Firstly, let us revisit our earlier analogy of the diverse breadth of human development that now spreads far and wide across the globe. Why is it so diverse? Why do homes in one place look different to homes in another place? Why do power grids take different forms? Why are roads wide in one place and narrow in another? Of course, it is no great mystery that all of the different forms that our buildings and infrastructure take arise out of needs, limitations, and environments. When settlers of old arrived in vastly different lands, for instance, they could not simply build their new dwellings in the way that they were accustomed, for the environment in which they found themselves was different. The odd settler may stubbornly cling to their old ways, but they would flounder unless they embraced their new environment. You must draw on building materials that are easily obtainable in your new environment, for instance, and if you have moved to a much warmer climate, you had better rethink the design of the house you are going to build. Likewise, your source of energy must be suited to the environment also. There is no good building wind turbines where there's no wind, or nuclear power plants if you have no access to radioactive materials. Even roads need to be made of readily accessible materials and follow the contours of the land. As is the case with the adaptation of animal species, however, the race to match your environment is not always quickly won. Many of the older cities of the world, for example, struggle to modernize as their layout was planned in earlier times when different needs prevailed. The narrow alleyways and townhouses situated cheek by jowl in the heart of town may have met the needs of the occupants hundreds of years ago, but they would be rather an obstacle to the modern town planner who needs to find a way to accommodate multiple lanes of motorized traffic. We find ourselves needing to make selections based on our present environment, but all the while, as we make our adaptations, the environment is changing. The manufacturer of technological products is always fighting a battle against time to best meet the demands of consumers, given the rapidly improving component specifications that are available for them to draw on. Likewise, the software developer must develop for the currently available hardware, only to find that by the time their software is ready for release, vastly improved hardware has become available. The struggle to adapt to our surroundings is an ever-present one. To take another example, consider the development and evolution of language around the world. Languages are very much species in their own right, often sharing common ancestors and thus a degree of similarity. When one language is interbred with another, we eventually end up with a new language. When speakers of a single language become isolated from each other, accents begin to change, and given enough time, two separated speakers of what was once the same language will no longer be able to understand each other. The ideas and patterns that underlie language must adapt to the environment, and the relevant terms will eventually fade from use. Whilst Inuit people may have 50 words for snow, desert nomads back in Africa would hardly find the need. Language is very much a product of our environment. Ultimately, the logical inevitability of evolution and the need for environmental adaptation is present in everything from particle distributions to our thought processes themselves. Even Herbert Spencer, who coined the term survival of the fittest, did so after drawing parallels of his own, such as to the functioning of the economy. In section 1.4, we discussed how we build models to explain the world around us and the need for those models to be dynamic and adaptive. New ideas that better model our environment must take the place of old, obsolete ideas that we come to recognize as no longer fit for purpose, given our increasing breadth of observational data. Our world is constantly changing, just as our thought patterns change. There is one noteworthy distinction, however, between Darwin's natural selection and the broader application of the concept of survival of the fittest, and that is the nature of the selection itself. Whereas the educated selection that we as conscious beings may engage in can lead to rapidly evolving dynamic systems, the much more random selection that nature engages in can, by comparison, cause evolution to progress at a glacial speed. But therein lies the genius of Darwin's theory. To recognize the logical process of evolution at work, even on such lengthy timescales where human history is but a drop in the ocean. Nevertheless, we really should recognize evolution at work in its broader form, and the fact that its logic is hard-coded into the universe itself. In the end, everything is molded by the environment in which it exists, and the environment itself is merely the sum of everything within it. Just as Leonardo da Vinci noted so long ago, everything is connected to everything else. It would seem that our reality is ultimately deterministic in its behavior, and no one and no thing is truly separate. All that is must be seen as a reflection of the universe that surrounds it.